Thank you all for joining us this evening for our board orientation training. My name is Lauren Kissel. I'm a director with CAMCO Management. And also presenting this evening is Julia Robbins, who is a senior vice president with CAMCO. Please, while we're going through the presentation, please remain on mute to reduce background noise. We will certainly open it up at the end. If you have questions throughout and you don't want to forget, feel free to put them in the chat. But at the end, we will open it up to questions, and certainly you can use the raise hand function or chat if you don't feel comfortable speaking in the group. So this evening's agenda, this meeting is really geared towards new board members and kind of understanding the expectations and some important things that you'll be dealing with as board members. So we'll be going through officer positions, governing documents, board meeting basics, some tips that we recommend that we have for board members, financials, the reserve study portal, and then there'll be a question and answer session at the end. So let's get started. So board officer positions. So typically your governing documents, specifically your bylaws, outline the specific board officer positions that are required of your association. But the four main ones that you'll see are president, vice president, treasurer, and secretary. So an important thing to keep in mind about the board officer positions, everyone has the same voting power, if you will. The president does not have more power than any of the other members of the board. They just sometimes have more responsibility. So the president typically serves as a liaison between the board and management. And they also preside over the meetings. So whether it's the board meeting or the annual meeting, the president typically takes the lead during those meetings. And as I sort of mentioned, the president doesn't have any more power, so they are not able to veto votes or change decisions that the board has made collectively as a whole. The next is vice president. Not all documents call for one, but the main duties of the vice president are really to step in if the president is not available for some reason. The next one is treasurer. This one is really important. They work hand in hand with your staff accountant that's assigned by CAMCO, and then also the CPA for the association in preparing the annual audits. The treasurer is also responsible for reviewing the financials on a monthly basis, and they're involved in the overseeing the budget process that happens on an annual basis. And then finally, there's a secretary, which the secretary ensures that the meeting minutes are taken and approved. And they are really entrusted with maintaining all the records for the association. And certainly when it comes to giving notice to the community for your annual meeting or any other meeting, they oversee that process, making sure it's done in compliance with your governing documents. And typically, again, these are the officer positions, but your board can range anywhere probably from 3 up to almost 9 members. So not all the time. Sometimes there just is like member at large positions. But again, everyone has the same voting power within the board. Next are the governing documents. So when an association is formed, there's always a set of governing documents. And really what these do, they define the rights and obligations of both the community and the owners. It creates a binding relationship between the owners and the community association. The governing documents establish the mechanisms for funding and the operations, and it also sets forth how the assessments are charged. So it's, for example, in a condominium, it's typically done on a percentage of interest basis, and that's how your fees are established on whether monthly or quarterly or annually, depending on how your association is set up. And your governing documents set forth the rules and standards which protect the owners and the community and enhance your property values, which is probably the most important thing to anyone, and promote harmonious living. So there's a bunch of different governing documents. There's also state There's the PA Condo Act if you're in Pennsylvania, and sort of state legislation, but we're really going to focus on the three that you as board members will interact and deal with the most. So the first is the declaration. It's also sometimes called the covenant conditions and restrictions, or the master deed, depending on what type of association you are or which state you're located in. So the declaration typically defines the portions of the community owned by the individual owner and what is owned by the community association. The declaration establishes the binding relationship between the owners and the community. It establishes the standards and restrictions which promote harmonious living. It also establishes the framework for the management of the community, and it outlines how the community is funded through the assessments. And it also establishes, especially if you're a newer community, your declaration typically establishes the transition process from the control from the developer over to the owners. Next are your bylaws. So bylaws really outline the administration and management of the community. So it defines the requirements for membership. It defines the requirements for member meetings, such as how often the board meetings need to occur, the annual meeting, when and where it needs to take place, or any other meetings such as budget meetings or just general association meetings that happen throughout the year. It also defines the voting rights of members and provides the procedure for electing you as the board members at the annual meeting. And again, also the different board officer positions are defined in the bylaws, and it also defines the general powers and duties that the board has. And lastly, the rules and regulations. This is by far the document that board members are going to be utilizing the most. So really the rules and regulations reiterate the standards and restrictions that are in the other governing documents, but it kind of takes it that next step and outlines them in more details. So it kind of, there might be some items that are outlined in your declaration, but it really gives more defined policies. So for example, it can set forth the ARC requirements, it can set in place noise policies, leasing policies, the association's trash and recycling policy. And it also does typically include a fine schedule if homeowners are in violation of any of the rules and regulations of the association. So some of the responsibilities and powers of the board. You as board members have what's called a fiduciary responsibility. You'll probably hear your manager talk about that a lot. You really, as a board member, you need to act in the best interest of the association. And you have what's called a duty of care, which is making informed decisions, and then a duty of loyalty, which is acting fairly and in good faith for the benefit of the association. As a board member, you do need to enforce the governing documents and the rules and regulations, and that needs to be done uniformly and consistently, going back to the duty of care and loyalty that you have. You as board members are given the ability to modify or change rules and regulations to help improve the operations of the community. However, they cannot conflict. If you do go to change a rule, it cannot conflict with the declarations or bylaws. It does have to be harmonious with your other governing documents. As far as the declarations and bylaws go, if the board wants to amend them, typically that does require a vote of the association, and your attorney and your manager could help guide you through that process if that's something the association and the board does need to do. So a little bit about board meeting basics and structures of board meetings. So there's typically two different types of board meetings, which are either open meetings or closed meetings. Open meetings essentially means that the membership are invited to attend the meeting, and they can also participate. Typically in an open meeting, either at the beginning or the end, the board has a time allotted for owners to bring concerns to the board to be discussed. versus what is a closed meeting. That is just a meeting that really takes place between the board and management. And typically at your board meeting, you're going to have what's called an executive session. So even if you have an open meeting or a closed meeting, there is a portion that is closed off to the public. That's typically during an executive session, you discuss more sensitive matters. So things such as legal, like collection status, or homeowners that are in violation, any lawsuits that might be happening within the community. So the agenda for your annual, agenda for your board meeting. So this is kind of just a standard example of how many managers at CAMCO and boards set up their meeting agendas. Typically, the first thing you're going to see are your action items, which are your approvals or affirmations. So at the very beginning, you're going to approve your meeting minutes or affirm that your meeting minutes were approved from the last board meeting if it was done via email. If there's contracts that need to be approved, this is the time in the meeting where you address such items. Next are informational items. This is really just more of a recap of things that have happened since the past meeting. It's not meant to really be a discussion. It's more just a time where the manager can let the board know what's been going on. So for example, some informational items is maybe a maintenance report if your association has a maintenance person of all of the items that have happened within the past, all the work orders that have happened within the past month. Next is old business. So really old business are topics or agenda items from the previous meeting that need further discussion. So maybe you were discussing a proposal last time and you wanted some additional details. The manager has gone back and gotten those details. And so now the contract is going to be discussed more under old business. New business is exactly as it sounds, or it's new agenda items that are a part of the meeting to discuss. And then finally, as I mentioned earlier, executive session where you talk about your delinquencies, any legal items, violations, things that are sensitive that are not meant for public consumption, if you will. So just some tips for successful board meetings. They really should be between 45 minutes to 2 hours in length. If your meeting is going longer than 2 hours, you're typically less attentive and really not having productive conversations at that point. What we have found internally, having these meetings via Zoom has definitely increased some of the productivity and the participation levels, because people can do it from their home. They don't need to travel to be at the board meeting. If you are a board that finds that you're going over your allotted 2 hours, timed agendas are a great option. It really helps you stay focused on target. You can designate certain amount of times for certain topics, and that way you're really moving the meeting along. You as board members, it's really helpful if you review the materials prior. So your manager is going to typically put together an agenda and a management report for you. And that's going to have a lot of items in there: financials and potential proposals, the last month's meeting minutes. It's really important that you take the time to review it prior so you're familiar and you're not seeing it for the first time at the meeting. Also, when you are going through and reviewing, if there's some things that you need to revise or there's something that you'd like added to the agenda, ask for those in advance so it's not a scramble when you're at the meeting and your manager can be prepared. And also, it's important to stay on track and follow the order of the agenda as you go through. So a little bit more about meeting minutes. The secretary is typically responsible for taking meeting minutes, though it's not always them. Sometimes the board members have someone else who volunteers to take the meeting minutes, but it really should never be the manager of the association. The manager needs to be engaged in what's happening during the meeting And also it's not that the manager would put anything, but it's not good practice because the manager is running it from their perspective as the management company versus you as the board who are representing the association. And what meeting minutes are is they are a legal record of the association, and it provides a historic log of information for the future. It really allows members of the community to stay up to date on what is happening with the association if they're not able to attend the meetings. And we also say it's a great idea for any new board member coming on to go back through and read maybe the last 6 months worth of meeting minutes for the association to kind of get caught up and up to speed on some of the items that the board's been dealing with in recent months. Items that should be included in your meeting minutes are the name of the association, what time the meeting was called to order and when it was adjourned, who is present and absent from the meeting, and then any actions or motions that take place. And the secretary or whoever is taking the minutes should keep a separate set of meeting minutes for the executive session. The meeting minutes of the association are typically approved and published and posted to the association's portal for all of the homeowners to see, but the executive session are a different set of meeting minutes that are kept internally with the board for their review and record. And meeting minutes should be a summary of what happened during the meeting, not necessarily a transcript. So some reminders for board members. For the conduct of meetings, boards should typically use a formal process for approvals. Many use what's called Robert's Rules of Order, and your governing documents will typically specify if you do need to use Robert's Rules of Order. Robert's Rules is very complicated, but it can also be boiled down to very simple of someone needs to make a motion, another person needs to second, it's open to discussion, and then it is put to a vote by affirmation of aye or nays. And it's also important to give your other fellow board members ample opportunity to provide their opinions and input. It's really important that boards are working together harmoniously and making sure to hear each other on topics. Board members, there really is a level of confidentiality. Anything that's discussed in executive session should not be discussed outside the meeting with other homeowners in the community. When you are discussing lawsuits, collections of violations, those are really meant only for the board and management. And matter of fact, you do have to take into account fair debt collection practices. So it's really important that the executive session is a confidential item. And we also recommend that board members create a specific email address to use for board business. This is really important because if, unfortunately, first of all, it helps keep you organized. So you know specifically it's not mixed in with all of the emails you get from, I don't know, New York Times or all of those subscriptions that are always trying to lure you back in. And it's also important because if, God forbid, the association is ever involved in a lawsuit, anything that's in your email address, your email is discoverable. And so if you're using your personal email, they could be sorting through that. So it's really important to consider creating a board specific email address for yourself. And finally, we really remind board members to be engaged. It's important to attend as many meetings as you can. We understand that you might not be able to make every single one, but being engaged is really important. It's important to be prepared and reviewing the pertinent materials before coming so you're able to participate in the discussions and decisions. And it's also important to regularly check your email. So that is all that I have. I'm now going to turn it over to Julia, who will be going over association financials, reserve studies, and our Vanica board portal.
Thank you, Lauren. All right, hello everyone. So I will start us off with association financial reports. So basically I'm going to go over the first few sections of the CAMCO produced financial reports for your association. The reason why we'll just go over the first few reports is basically this is going to have the most useful or important information typically within the financial packet. The reports that are following these specific reports that we'll go over are just more elaborated information on the initial reports. So let's get started here. Again, if you do have any questions specifically about your association's financials, please feel free to let your CAMCO manager know or your staff accountant with CAMCO. We can definitely get you linked up with them if you have any specific questions too. So we'll start here with the narrative page, and the narrative is typically the first page on all of our financial reports. The narrative is going to provide a quick overview of what's in the report itself. It's something that we provide for our association specifically, and it's a very helpful tool to help you navigate through the financial report. So basically the narrative is going to go over your, it's going to go over an overview of your income and expenses, and it will have your net total, which has your surplus or deficit. Now, throughout the financial report on the more on the left-hand side of the package, you're going to have your month to date, where your right-hand side is going to have your year to date. The narrative is also going to have the cash position, which you'll see in the next second little box there, your change in your accounts receivable, your accounts payable, and any accruals, and it will also have your operating reserve status and your replacement reserve status, as well as a listing of any capital replacement reserve expenditures. Just two things, sorry, I forgot to mention on the narrative. The things that you generally want to focus on this narrative is your year-to-date actual column where your net total is. It can adjust obviously throughout the year based on your particular association and how everything is calendarized. But generally that's something that we do first look at when we are reading the financial report. It's also important to keep an eye on your operating reserve status and your replacement reserve status throughout the year. So the next slide is going to be the balance sheet. So the balance sheet does restate some of the information that we did see on the narrative, but it's going to break it down into your assets, liabilities, and equity sections. So the assets would include the cash, any prepaid expenses, as well as any other asset accounts your particular association may have. Liabilities would include any loans, any accounts payable, and any accrued expenses. And then your equity section would include any prior year equity accounts, current year equity accounts, and that would also include your net income or loss that we just discussed on the narrative page. All right. So next is our statement of revenues and expenses. So this is, again, a very important report within your financial package. So basically it's going to provide your revenues at the top portion of the statement, and then all of your expenses below that. Again, we'll see that you have on the left-hand side where it says current period, that's your month to date. And then the right-hand side where it says year to date is obviously your year to date section. The furthest section on the right-hand side has your annual budget for the year as well. So revenues are generated typically always from owner's assessments, any special assessments that you may have, and any other miscellaneous income. And then your operating expenses are broken down into groupings, which include utilities, maintenance, central systems, grounds maintenance, professional services, and then you have a capital reserve and taxes. Also, some of you may have a salary section as well if you have employees for your particular association. So just something to focus on with the statement of revenues and expenses is going to be your variance column. That's something that we generally are going to focus on when we are looking at the financial report, because it will tell you where your association may be overspending or underspending for the month or the year. All right, so that was just, again, a general overview of our financial reports. You will find more reports within your individual associations packets, but feel free to, again, let us know if you have any specific questions on the reports once you get them. So now we'll talk about reserve studies, and reserve studies correlate directly with the financials because they help to determine the reserve funding necessary for your association. So what is a reserve study for those of you who don't know? So a reserve study is an in-depth evaluation of a property's physical components and an analysis of the cost and time frame for anticipated replacements or major repairs to common area elements. So the reserve study includes both a physical and a financial component. So reserve studies are, again, necessary to determine the appropriate level of funding for your community each year. So typically, where do you get a reserve study from? You would typically hire a third-party engineering firm or a reserve study company that would be able to review your particular association and determine the necessary level of funding and what components are there. Some associations will utilize firms that they've used in the past, while others, may want to change their particular reserve study firm, and your manager can help you get different proposals for that. Typically within the reserve studies, they're going to project a 30-year period, but it's generally recommended to get your reserve study updated every 3 to 5 years. More along the 3-year side if you are having a lot of large capital projects done. So we'll start with the physical analysis. So the physical analysis is an inventory of all of your major common area components, an assessment of each component's current condition and remaining life, a description of how the assessment was conducted, cost estimates for each component's repair or replacement, and the sources used to obtain the cost estimate. So basically, they're going to review all of the association's common area components. That could include roadways, sidewalks, different components of hallways, your lobby if you're in a building, exteriors of buildings, roofing. It just, again, depends on your particular community, but they'll generally perform a site visit with the reserve study itself, and they'll review each one of those components, and they will give their general estimate based on an overview of the current condition if they can see it. And also they'll gather information from both the manager and the board as to when those components were last replaced as well. So the next portion of the reserve study is the financial analysis, and this is generally what's needed for determining your level of reserve funding for your budget each year. So the financial analysis is going to have a summary of the reserve amount needed for the projected expenses. It will have an evaluation of your current funding and reserve balance. So when we get a reserve study done, we're giving them typically the end of year balance, or whenever you're getting the reserve study done, we're giving them how much you currently have in your capital reserve account, and then how much funding you are currently adding each year. So they will assess that, and they will give you the recommended annual funding plan to offset expenses. So if they feel that, you could use 5% more, 10% more, or if there's a certain dollar threshold, they will lay that out typically on a chart for you within the reserve study. And then they'll give you a description of the methods used to compute the funding status. I just want to preface all of that by saying that They're general guidelines in terms of the funding required for the replacement items. Same thing with the remaining useful life for the physical components. So it's generally used as a guideline. And I'll get into more detail on what we do once we get those guidelines. So here are the benefits of a reserve study. So number one is the board fiduciary duty compliance. So the fiduciary duty is basically to ensure that you're funding your reserves appropriately according to a third-party professional. And it also is your fiduciary duty to make sure that you're reviewing replacement projects when necessary. So it helps to identify what projects should come next on the pipeline of being done. It's a communication tool for your residents or your homeowners. So basically you can use that reserve study to say, this is why we need to have the reserve funded at this level. This is why we potentially had to increase fees or implement a special assessment. And it also shows them, you know, all of the projects that they may have not thought about or the costs that are affiliated with them. And then last but not least, it helps you to prioritize the capital projects and preventative maintenance. So the reserve study may list something on it that, you know, we hadn't thought of, or that, you know, we didn't think needed to be done soon. So it's very helpful to have that. And then with that goes capital planning. So typically it's going to help you to decipher which projects should be reviewed and in what order. So generally, when you look at the reserve study, you're going to look at a 5 to 10 year period of the projects that they have outlined that should be coming up next. And then the board can review them and sort of determine, you know, what they want to plan out in what order. And then generally, we will obtain proposals for definitive costs on the upcoming projects, because like I said, it is just a guideline as far as the funding that they project that you might need for that specific project. And it also helps you to involve engineers or architects where applicable. So depending on the project, you may or may not need to get an engineer involved to help see that through. And then again, another reminder that the remaining useful life in the reserve study is an estimate. The components can last longer, or they may need replacement before they have projected in there. But overall, it's better than, you know, the board just determining sort of arbitrarily that something should get replaced before another item, or, you know, assessing a specific number to that. So it's a very useful tool to have. And we do recommend having a reserve study for your association. All right, and last but not least, we have our Vanica board portal plug here at the end. So for those of you who may be new to your board, we do host training each month for our Vanica software and our board portal, which is basically a section of our software that the board is able to use. So it allows for full transparency into our management software, and it allows you to kind of see what's going on with your particular association. So you'll see on this little screenshot here that you have a board action section. It's a little drop down tab when you sign into your portal. You will have that section, whereas the regular homeowners would not, obviously. It gives you access into open and closed architectural requests, invoices, violations, and work orders. It also gives you access into your homeowners list. There's specific account ledgers, balances, contact information, and requests. And the board members are also able to pull reports in real time as well. So this is just a reminder that we do host these sessions twice a month. One session per month is held at 12 noon and the other session is held at 6 p.m. so that we can try to capture anybody who wants to join us. We do have what are called beginner and advanced sessions. Beginner sessions basically go over The full portal itself, so not only the sections that the homeowners would see, but also the sections that the board members would see. And then advanced just goes over the board action section only, and it's more for questions or comments from board members who have utilized the system quite a bit. Our next sessions for the Vanica board portal training are on Tuesday, February 6th at noon, and then Thursday, February 8th at 6 p.m. And we send out the invites the same way that you received the invite for this evening's session. So that is all I have. And now we will open it up for some questions and answers. So if you have any questions, feel free to raise your hand or ask the questions within the chat. It looks like we did get maybe 1 or 2 questions in here. Copies of the presentation, it would be very helpful to have. So we actually will have the link to the recording of this evening's session that we can distribute. And we also, like Lauren was saying, we'll be posting as well. So generally we would send out the actual recording. If you really would like the copy of the presentation, just reach out to us and we can send you a copy. Okay, we've gotten some questions in here. Great presentation. Okay, Ruben, my login to the portal does not include the board action section. Okay, Ruben, I will review your portal and get you assigned there. We had a question from Maria. How is our reserves right now? That is probably a question directly for your manager. That they can sort of help you out with determining for your association. And if you don't have a reserve study, they can help get you guys some proposals to get one done. All right. Anybody else have a question? Okay, how do we get a login for the portal? Sorry, got a lot of chats coming in at once. How do we get a login for your portal? So depending on your association, if you're a newer client, I know some of our newer clients, their portals are launching in February, on February 1st. So if that's the case, then you will get a login after that date. But if your association has been with CAMCO for some time, just reach out to your community manager and they can get you set up with a login.
So Kathleen, your question is, are board meetings taped to back up the minutes? No, typically board meetings are not recorded. The meeting minutes serve as sort of the record of what took place in the meeting.
Great. And William had a question about, does the invoices section of the portal include approved invoices? It would be helpful to see some history. So yes, it would include open invoices, which mean the invoice still has to be processed and paid out. And then it includes a closed section, which would be any invoices that were approved and paid.
The caveat to that, though, just to, if you are a newer association to CAMCO, it is only going to have what has been processed by CAMCO through Vanica. It's not going to have anything historical from your previous management company.
Yes, thank you, Lauren.
You're welcome.
Good point.
I have a question.
Sure, go ahead, Rita.
Yes, I'm new to the position of recording secretary, and I see here that I'm entrusted with maintaining association records. Other than the meeting minutes that I take and get approved with every month, and I hold on to them, what other records am I supposed to be maintaining?
So in this situation, typically the bylaws and the officer positions are written in a way where if there isn't a management company in place, that would be the secretary's responsibility. Your association has opted to hire a professional management company. So we maintain a lot of those records, but typically that's referring to the governing documents or any official notices that have gone out to the community, such as the annual meeting notices or any notices of special assessments, those types of items. But we as your management company typically keep all those records digitally for you. I hope that helps. And
very, very much so, because I thought I was missing something that I wasn't sure of.
no, I'm sure you're doing a great job. I said the other night on a meeting that I think besides president, I think secretary is usually the least desired position. So I commend you for volunteering to be the secretary. And Brad, you just asked a question about where the board meeting minutes will be posted in the portal. Those will be located under the documents section. Typically, there's a subfolder called meeting minutes. We like to organize them by year, and that's where they would be posted for homeowner review. We can also create another subfolder for the executive meeting minutes, and then that folder permission can be set to board only view. Again, shamelessly, for more information on how the document sections work, please attend our Vanica board portal trainings. It really gives a lot of insight to all the functionality that's available. Kathleen, you're assigned to take the meeting minutes. Does that mean you're the board secretary? Not necessarily. I'm not sure. You might want to confirm with your property manager. It's not always the secretary that takes the minutes, but typically it is.
Oh yes, I was asked to take the minutes for the meeting, and I said okay. And then I asked what I do with them with the property manager. But since we're in between property managers. That we have to, I'll need more direction.
No problem. Kathleen, I will make a note of your name and I will get in touch with you.
I appreciate that. Thank you.
No problem.
It looks like we had a couple more questions. So one person asked, how do I know what things I'm in charge of for my community as a board member? That's something that, you know, like Lauren was mentioning with the board positions, you know, if you have an officer position such as secretary, you would be responsible for minutes, treasurer, reviewing the financials. So it really depends on your position with the board. And if you are just a member at large, and maybe there are committees in your community as well that you could be involved with, but that's something that should be discussed with your individual board itself and manager.
And so Bill, you had a question regarding the board minutes. You are correct. So typically what happens is the secretary sends out a draft copy of the meeting minutes. They're reviewed by the board. And then once they are formally approved by the board, either via email or at the meeting, they can then be finalized and posted to the portal or circulated to the membership. But yes, it's the final version, not the draft version that gets published.
Yeah, that makes sense.
Are there any other questions this evening?
Documents so far.
I'll put all the minutes in the documents. Okay. Maybe I'll double check. I'll double check with Heather. Okay.
All right. I just wanted to mention too that we will be hosting another board member orientation session. We're hosting them quarterly. So our next session is on April 12th at 6 p.m. So if you want to join us again, you're more than welcome. Or if you have any other board members that have joined your board, please encourage them to attend.